Welcome to Sexology, a podcast that untangles the science of sex and pleasure. And now, with this week's episode, your host, clinical psychologist, Dr. Lanae St.
Hey there! Welcome to another episode of Sexology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lanae St. A few weeks ago, we had this show on how to talk to your child about sex, and it was very well received. I heard from many of you guys on how the show gave you some ideas on how to talk about sex with your children, and you wanted us to explore it further. More importantly, you wanted us to have an episode on how to talk to your teenagers about it, because it's one thing if you want to talk about sex with your child, which is very important, but the conversation is different when you have a teenager. So I decided to have another episode on this topic, and I invited Dr. Lanae St. to talk about this. We're going to talk about how much parents need to ask their teens about their sexual behaviors. We're going to explore the concept of consent, parenting a homosexual teen, and how to keep your teenagers safe. Dr. Lanae St. is a board-certified sexologist, sexuality educator, and writer. She received her doctorate in Human Sexuality from the Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality, where she focused on child and adolescent sexuality. She develops curriculum, teaches classes, and works with clients to normalize conversation about sexuality between parents and children. Here's my conversation with Dr. Lanae St. Welcome back to another episode of Sexology Podcast. I am super excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. Lanae St. As I mentioned, she's a board-certified sexologist and a sexuality educator. Dr. Lanae, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Mohali.
Of course. It is. I was just, before recording, I was sharing with you that I know one of your area of expertise is child and adolescent sexuality, and I was reading your blogs a few days ago, and they're just so informative.
Thank you.
How did you
Thank you.
Yeah, how did you get interested? It's such an interesting niche and specialty. How did you get interested in that aspect of sexuality?
Well, it actually sort of popped up to me really quickly in my sex education training. I went to the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality a number of years ago, and pretty much right away that came up as something that was really sort of the niche that I wanted to focus on. And I mean, I have two kids of my own, and back when I started school, they were much younger. And it just seemed, I had been having these conversations with them since they were 3 and 5. And it started off with really basic things like the proper names, the correct anatomical terms for the different parts of the body. And it really just sort of took off from there.
Right. And I love that you did that with your children, because sometimes when I have this conversation with parents, they're kind of like wondering, why is it important to talk to teens about sex? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, specifically when it comes to teens, I mean, well, all kids are practicing for adulthood, right? And if they're able to talk about topics related to sex, love, dating, relationships, things like that, makes it easier for them to talk about these things when they're older and, eventually in relationships of their own. Yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, and many parents, it's so interesting. They kind of, because it is challenging to talk about sex with your teens and children, they kind of like delegate this job to the school, and they say, oh, they learn from their sex education classes. What do you think about that? Do you think is that sufficient?
Well, it's not always sufficient to rely just on the schools. I mean, it depends on what state you live in. For example, what's permitted to be taught in that particular state. I was just looking at some of the statistics last night, and I can give you a link for this. According to the Guttmacher Institute, as of July 1st, 2017, there are 24 states and the District of Columbia that mandate sex education. 22 mandate both sex ed and HIV education. But here's the part that's probably the most eye-opening. only 13 states require that the instruction be medically accurate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so 13 out of our entire United States only require that the information be medically accurate. So, who knows what's actually being said in the curriculum.
I didn't know
And
that was optional.
If I were a parent, I wouldn't want my kids being taught something other than if we compare it to any other subject, right? Let's say we compare it to science or, I don't know, math. Like, would we want our kids to be taught something different than what the rest of the country is being taught, or that is even accurate according to, medical or whatever, whoever the governing body or whatever.
Right. That is so interesting. And, the other thing that my experience is that for my children, I want them to have the education that's at least congruent with my values. Growing up, I had the sex education was more around like sex negative topics. And it was just like scarce, like strategies about STI, pregnancy. And if you're a parent, say you don't want your children necessarily have a negative perspective on sexuality, I think it's just important to be able to communicate that with your children and teens.
Yeah. And most education around sexuality has to do with plumbing and prevention. Right. So you've got how things work and how to prevent STIs or pregnancy, right? That's sort of the overarching plumbing and prevention model. But there's another P that's missing here, and it's pleasure. And it does freak out a lot of parents to talk about pleasure as it relates to their kids becoming sexual beings or being sexual, but it's really important. I mean, when I first started studying about human sexuality, it became pretty clear to me that you have these, I identified them as the 5 building blocks to a healthy sexuality. And they don't really have anything to do with, where penises go or what you do with vaginas or things like that, but they really help to develop a solid foundation. And they are communication, consent, respect, pleasure, and fantasy.
Oh, I love that.
And yeah, thank you. Each of those things are independent, but they do work together as well. Communication has to do with being able to express yourself, your needs, wants, desires, being able to talk about emotions, being able to have emotion. It also covers, sort of that nonverbal communication as well, right? So if somebody freezes up, it's important to ask, like, what's going on for you? What's happening? You've got consent, which, there's a lot of talk about consent these days. And we can go into that a little deeper. Respect in the way I think about it, there's a lot of different aspects, but respect for self and for others. It's also, when you talk about respect for self, I think of that as, respect for your body and, having a healthy body image as well. The last 2 bullet points of the 5 building blocks are pleasure and fantasy. And these 2 are the hardest for parents and for adults in general. You have pleasure. Most adults sexualize, I would say, a lot of things, if not everything.
Right.
And pleasure can be something as simple as a hug. Pleasure is self-care. There's a lot of different aspects to pleasure that don't have anything to do with sexuality or being sexual with another being, but they do have a lot to do with developing a healthy sense of self as well. A hug can be, I say this, I've said this a number of times. I think I've written it a couple of times too. Hugs are so important and they can be so moving. A hug can evoke tears if you really need a hug, and a hug can soothe tears. And so, something as simple as a hug is totally about pleasure, but it's not sexual pleasure, right? And it's just there's so much more than just sexual pleasure. Fantasy, the last bullet point, is one that, it really, like I said, it's tough for adults. Fantasy is healthy. It's healthy to fantasize. People have a difficult time talking about their fantasy. And if you look at little kids when they play, they can get really involved, right? And as adults, taking that sense of play with our adult partners is also something that's really, really healthy. And being able to talk about it, ideally without any shame or judgment. Not all fantasies work out to be acted out, but it's certainly something that can be healthy to talk about. It can help you
Absolutely.
even be deeper with your partner.
Right. And I like how you have this holistic kind of approach and view of sexuality, because many people, because of the way that kind of they learn about sexuality, they get so narrowed down on what is it sexual and what's not. And it just misses so many elements.
Yeah. It's really key to be able to have people you can talk to, people you trust that you can talk to about sexuality. I mean, it goes for teens being able to talk to their parents or any other trusted adult, but being able to talk about the easy stuff as well as the tough stuff is important. And I find that, being able to start with the easy stuff, obviously it's the easy stuff, right? But I've gotten to a point now where my kids ask me questions about things like, what are beer goggles? It's a really good question, right? I mean, My daughter stumbled upon it in a book that she was reading, and she asked me, well, what are beer goggles? And, it relates to, love, dating, relationships, sex, alcohol, there's a lot of things that, that kids are learning about or seeing in the wild, that it's important to be able to have someone to ask these questions of.
Absolutely. And the other part of it is that some parents, they think that if they talk to their children or teens about sex, they give them permission or they're going to be more sexual. But these are it's part of human being, and this like sexuality, sex is everywhere in our environment, in the media. And just it's such a wonderful way that you create a space for a child and teens to ask those questions from you versus then getting it from a random information from the internet or
Well, and it's funny, I had to laugh when you said that because, yes, absolutely. People think if you do talk about sex there, it's going to make kids want to go out and do it. But when I talked to my daughter, my oldest asked me the question, something like, why are parents so weird? Why are adults so weird about sex? Like, why is this such a weird topic? And I said, well, some people think that if you talk to your kids about sex, they're going to want to go out and do it. And my daughter said, well, you can teach me about the center of the earth, but it doesn't mean I'm going to go down there and try to find out about it. I was like, okay.
Very insightful.
It's a pretty straightforward response. Yeah. I mean, you asked the question about, like, can parents depend on sex education in the schools? And I think you mentioned it about the values, right? It's really important to have education for your kids as it relates to your values and as it relates to human sexuality. And it's important for parents to seek this out themselves as well, getting really clear on what their values are, because it's not something that we discuss. So it's hard to talk to our kids about it, right? So, my kids have had, a pretty thorough education about sex and sexual behaviors here at home. But I also sent my daughter to the OWL program, Our Whole Lives. And it's, I can send a link for this as well. The program she went through was for her grade level, and it was 7th to 9th grade. And it was an hour and a half once a week for 26 weeks. I mean,
it's more than many of my colleagues receive.
Exactly. But to go through this, through the OWL program, and why I thought it was really important too, is she was with a group of peers, and they really got to discuss values. And I think those first few classes especially were really, really a great foundation for her to talk with other kids and other people her age and to really see kind of what other people were thinking and what are some of the values that kids have around when do they think they'll want to be sexual? When do they think they'll want to have kids? And, what do you think is important to be in place when you do have a kid? And so, if you're not thinking about, well, it might be good to have a job or maybe a support system in place, who would be there for me if I had a kid? How would I take care? These are all things that,
right.
Do we really sit down and talk about these things with our kids? Not often, so to have a peer group and a really amazing program that goes through all that with your kids, it's really, really great.
That's
and we
wonderful.
started lots of good conversations for us at home here too.
That is great. And please feel free to send us the link. I'll make sure I put it on show notes. And I love that they had this, they were exploring the topic versus on saying, oh, this is the way it should be. Like teen pregnancy is bad. This is good. So that's good that they always created a space for discussion and exploration.
Yeah. And I was really sort of interested in the curriculum before I even had her go. And so I was, obviously all parents are really concerned. What are they going to be teaching my kids? And there wasn't anything in this entire curriculum that I had any problems with. And if there were any questions my daughter had, she felt comfortable coming to me afterwards to say, well, what do you think about this? I wrote a blog about her final takeaway, because it was something like, if you're not mature enough to be able to talk about sex, then you probably shouldn't be having sex.
That is so interesting.
And there are plenty of adults who can't talk about it. So I'm sure that's not going to, that sort of a thought might not go over so well because people want to have sex.
Right.
Right.
But I make sure I put a link on that in the show notes too, because there's very important information for people to have and kind of like learn about these programs from a sex educator, because there's so many random information out there and you don't know which one you can truly trust.
Right. Exactly. It is difficult to know which one you can trust. I'm not a big proponent of programs that really do a lot of moralizing or telling people what they should be doing. It's tough. It's one of the things where if you're going to talk to your kids, you have to be able to listen more than talk, especially when they're teens, because they do have thoughts. They do see the same thing. They see things differently than we do. They see them with different eyes. And so, there's a whole big world out there that they're observing, and it might not have been the exact same way as we were seeing it when we were that age, but it's really important to be able to have someone to talk about it.
Right. The other thing that you mentioned that was interesting that I definitely want to make sure we're exploring more is consent. I know that is such an important topic, and I love how the conversation evolved compared to the time I was at school. I know back when I was a teenager, it was the extent of conversation was no means no. And that wasn't enough. And now I love how different people are talking about it and they give awareness about how complex the topic is. So when parents are talking about consent with their teens, what are some of the topics you encourage them to discuss with?
So No Means No was a good program when it first came out, right?
Right.
But there's a piece of, and I think I mentioned it earlier, when someone gets really quiet, right? Or when they stop talking, it's important to, find out what's going on there. So how I started talking to my kids about consent, and at the time, I didn't even realize that it was consent, to be honest. My mom came over with my sister and my sister's daughter, and I hadn't seen the baby for about, it was probably like 9 months. We don't live real close by, so don't get to see each other very often. And so when she came over, I squatted down near the front door and I put my arms out and I said, "Oh, come give me a big hug." And, she hadn't seen me. She held onto mom's leg. And it was in that moment where I realized, oh, she's not comfortable. She doesn't know me. I said, "Okay, that's fine. When you're ready, I'm here to give you a hug whenever you want." It was sort of like giving her permission that she could come to me. But at the same time, my mom, who is, they grew up in very traditional American background and values, said to me, "Oh, just grab her and give her a hug." And I was like, well, no. Her body language is telling me very clearly she was, still very young, but able to stand up and hold on to mom, but sort of pre-verbal to be able to say, "I don't know you. I'm not comfortable with you. Let me warm up to you." And it's important for adults. It's not about me, right? I shouldn't be taking this personally or trying to give her a guilt trip. "Oh, you forgot who your auntie is, or you don't love me," or like any of those things. That makes no sense to them, because then that makes them feel bad about standing up for themselves. And I would never want a kid to feel bad for standing up, for, not wanting to come hug me. It's not about me.
Right.
So, and then that was like a big aha moment for me. And so from that point on, I really started talking to my kids about how, if we're playing and they want me to stop, they just say stop. And so when they were really little, it was one of the common things we did was tickle, right? One of those
Right.
fun things parents like to do with their kids. And, one kid is on her back and I'm tickling. And I had sort of this moment or a flash of being in the reverse position,
Right.
being the person towered over by this person who is so much bigger than me, and really not being able to have the strength or control to be able to get them to stop if I wanted them to stop. And I stopped and I said, if you ever are uncomfortable or it's too much or the tickling, you feel like you're going to pee or whatever, just tell me to stop and I'll stop. And so I said, let's try it, kind of little role play. I said, okay, ready? Go. Tickle. And then she's like, stop. So I froze, almost like, just like freezing. And then she sort of like caught her breath. I'm like, okay, go. And so it started up again. So, but that was like the first lesson in consent, right? If you want the person to stop, ask them to stop. And now granted, hopefully in every situation that would be the case, but, teaching that now at 2, where then that's something that they can translate to when they're 12 or 22, that's really important. I would say consent also, cover consent in everyday interactions. I mean, my kids, they'll argue about, stop touching me or something, stuff like that. And, I often hear, it'll start to escalate, stop touching me, leave me alone, whatever. And then the thing that stops them is one will usually say, no consent. And then everything stops. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting that telling someone to stop touching me doesn't have them stop, right? But if you say no consent in my house, that's like
That is so awesome.
Yeah, it's funny. There are educators that do a really good job of talking about this too, and I'll give you a link for this one too. But Al Vernacchio is a sex educator on the East Coast, and he did a TED Talk talking about sex as pizza and how it relates to consent is, getting, it's also communication too. It's a big piece of communication, but being able to talk about moving away from the analogy of sex as playing baseball or some sports analogy.
I see.
Because usually there's two sides and there's a winner and a loser,
Right.
And then also the bases are very, very heterocentric and also sort of feed into that orgasm as a goal, or, there's like a right way to do sex or a right way to have sex, and intercourse is it, right? And the pizza analogy takes the approach that if you are with a partner or partners, if the case may be that, and you're an adult and engaging in, multiple partner sex or whatever the case may be, being able to talk to a person and say, like, what do we want on our pizza? Like, what do we want to do here? What are the different things that are on the menu?
What a neat way of putting that. I haven't watched
Right?
that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's probably more mature. You wouldn't necessarily, you'd have to judge for yourself what age you'd want to talk to that about with your kids. But yeah, I thought that was a really excellent analogy for communication and consent. There's a big piece of respect in that too, I can see, and also pleasure. So it hits 4 of my
That's
4 of my building
great.
blocks.
Yeah, I watched the one about tea. Have you seen the tea one? And
yeah.
That's our joke at home with my husband, and it's just so funny. And I just I love how in that video also they go into different scenario. That's just such a funny video.
My oldest loves that tea and consent video. She really does. When we talked about that recently, my youngest is like, I haven't seen that yet. Can I see that? So we'll have to pull that one up for her too. I can send you a link for that one too.
Yeah, for sure. I think these are just such a important, but sometimes when it's not applied to people, dry content, that I love it when they're put in such a playful way of like presenting it.
Yeah. I mentioned it before we got on the call. Sex is fun. It can be fun. It certainly is funny. So being able to have I wouldn't say a cavalier attitude about it, but really being able to be comfortable and and open, and being able to talk to a partner, building these skills as a teen is important, and being able to talk with a, future partner is everything.
Absolutely. And I wanted to switch a little bit to another topic that I hear a lot from parents. And I know we briefly talked about it. You brought an excellent point before the recording. Sometimes parents come to me and say, like, how would they know if they're parenting a homosexual teens? Because they want to make sure that they facilitate the coming out process. And and I know we talked a little bit about it before the recording, and I would love it if you can share your perspective with our listeners about that topic.
Sure. So as I was preparing for today's interview, I was sort of thinking through some possible scenarios and topics to talk about. And this one was one that came up, and sometimes my daughters will come in and they'll want to know, what are you doing? And I mentioned what I was doing, and I said, how would a parent know if they were parenting a homosexual teen? And my oldest said, well, why is it important to know that? And I thought, well, that's it's an interesting question, right? So from a teen's perspective, like, why would a parent want to know? And the things that pop into my mind is most parents want to help protect their kids. They want to be there for their kids. They want to keep their kids safe. And this can go into, the safety aspect is so huge. And that really is sort of an overarching topic as it relates to sex and sexuality and drugs and alcohol and all those other things. But when it comes to parenting a homosexual teen, the situation's not going to be the same for every situation. Most likely the kid is figuring out their sexuality around that same time too, if they don't already know it. Sometimes they'll figure it out before you get a chance to figure out what their sexuality is or will be. I guess the most important part of this is it's that unconditional love part, regardless of what genitalia your partner or your child is going to want to engage with in the future. If it's going to be a same-sex interaction or a heterosexual interaction. Just being able to be there for your teen and show them love regardless of who they're going to be in love with in the future. Some parents just know if their teen is homosexual. Sometimes it's tougher to tell if your teen is bisexual, for example. You're going to get mixed signals.
Right.
And I guess it goes back to, so ask yourself why it's important to know. Is there judgment that's happening? Are you uncomfortable with what may be coming out if your kid is gay and you don't understand homosexuality? Maybe that's a time to start judging less and examining inside more, like, where does this come from? What kind of messages did I get growing up about homosexuality? Or when did I know that I was heterosexual? Just start asking yourself some questions as well, because they're probably questioning themselves as well. So being able to ask a question. Ideally, you're willing and able to accept your child for who they are. I know in some cases that's not always easy, especially when religion or socialization, it may not be acceptable in the culture or in the neighborhood or whatever the overarching, or with the religion, whatever the overarching rules or guidelines you've grown up with. Maybe homosexuality is not so welcome. So I really have to examine, so what's going on under the surface here for myself as well.
Right. And I love when you kind of talk about parents being intentional about why is it important for you to know. As you mentioned, I know, fortunately, in some part of the world and even in US, people are not safe because of their orientation. And also they don't have as much resources to talk about what they're experiencing. And it's important to help the teens feeling safe and at least have that space with you that they can kind of explore their feelings.
Right. And there are a number of fantastic organizations that help teens with either the feelings they're having or exploring, trying to figure themselves out. Sometimes the organizations are in the school. Sometimes they're community-based organizations. Yeah, this is a case where Google can be really helpful, but also knowing someone who has access to or knowledge of the different resources that are out there. That's also really important because sometimes Google's not always totally helpful.
Right, you
Having
get
someone
mixed
who's
of
sex positive.
information. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of the show that sex negativity is something that a lot of people grew up with. Nowadays, there are really a lot of very sex positive, good sources of information as it relates to, sexuality in whatever niche you are looking for. There's someone who is specializing in that.
Right. And the last topic I wanted to check in with you about is something that comes up frequently in my practice, I would say like from time to time, but it's been my experience that that's an issue that some of the parents struggle with. So I like when parents realize that their teen has been engaging in risky sexual behaviors. For example, a few weeks ago, I had a teen that was talking with someone online. They learned that the guy was like, it was this like a young female, and the guy was significantly older than her. And obviously the law enforcement got involved and the parents were panicking, and it was such a complicated issue. And I know there are a number of risky behaviors that their teen engaging in, and part of it's developmentally that's appropriate. But how can parents kind of support their kids, and what do they need to do when they learn that their teens are engaging in these behaviors?
So I saw a video recently that a local police department sent around on Facebook, and it was a situation where a young man was, with the permission of the parents, posing as a young teen boy and sort of not really luring, but yeah, I guess it was luring 12, 13, and 14-year-old girls to come out and meet him at a park or allow him to come over after the parents had either gone to sleep or left the house. And it was sort of this scared straight scenario where,
Right.
The parent is just out of eyesight. And as soon as the kid approaches or opens the door, the parent will yell or, jump in. And that's, the kid starts crying. I can't imagine being in that situation, how traumatic that would be, like just paralyzing almost. But really, the whole thing boils down to the topic of safety. It's really not about the sex. It's more about how do we keep our kids safe? And understandably, parents are concerned. They want their kids to be safe. I want my kids to never be in a situation that puts them in any harm, right? That's a parent,
Of course,
normal
right,
parent, desire. But I think, in my situation, what I did is I sat down with my kids and I've been really open with them and made it basically that it's a safety issue. No matter what situation they find themselves in, they can come to me. We've got a code that if my kids are out, I mean, they're certainly not to this age yet, but it's coming up. If they're out with friends and they're in a situation they're finding themselves not comfortable anymore, say somebody starts drinking or doing drugs or whatever, we have a code that she can text me and I will come and get her, no questions asked.
Oh, that's fantastic.
It's certainly not going to be, we'll never talk about the topic, but at the moment, I'm not going to be, I'm not going to rush in and be like, what are you doing? Why are you drinking? Why are they drinking?
Right.
None of that is going to happen at the time. I'm committing that I'm not going to be angry at the time, but we are going to have a discussion later, about what's happened here. How did this come about? But it boils down to safety. I mean, if my kid sneaks out of the house and gets into a situation where she needs my help and I don't know where she is, I can't, I don't know how to, I can't come get her. Right. So, I think my kids understand, I think I've shown in many cases that, or in at least the cases that it's important, that I'm going to stick up for them. I'm going to have their back, and they trust that I'm being honest when I say this is about safety. It's not about me trying to be controlling, and I see this behavior I saw it in myself, and I've seen it in friends. If I get a thrill out of keeping a secret or sneaking away, that's going to come with me when I get older. And it could translate in the future to not being completely honest with my partner or or myself, and doing this sort of like risky behaviors, risky situations, and getting a thrill out of it, but it not necessarily being a good thing for me. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. No, yeah. And I love that because, sometimes teens are, as you said, like it's a good practice for adulthood and being transparent and putting their safety first. But the other thing, as you were talking about, I was thinking about a training I had for sex trafficking. I went to this continuing education, and the Long Beach police was talking about that one of the ways that traffickers kind of like hook the teens and kind of like set up the setting that they cause them to kind of like put them in a risky situation is their fear of parents' reaction when they're going to figure out. And I love that when you have that approach of no question asked in that moment, I'm not going to get angry. So if the safety is an issue, they know they can count on the parent.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are too many stories out there, even if it's not a trafficker, but it could be, do you remember the story of Amanda Todd?
No.
Well, there was a young woman, a number of years ago, probably 6 years ago or so now, where she was online and someone asked her to flash her boobs. And when she flashed her breasts, they took a screenshot, and then they proceeded to blackmail her and bully her and started to share the information with friends, people at the school. And then, of course, along comes the slut shaming that peers do to each other.
Right.
And the young woman wasn't comfortable talking to her parents about what had happened. And, it's not even just that situation. There are lots of situations where kids get themselves into awkward situations and internalize, they completely go inside themselves. They can't talk to someone else and say, okay, look, I did something really stupid and now there's a consequence, or this is what's happening to me and I need help. And I absolutely want to be there to help my daughter, or if I had a son, help my son get out of a situation like that where someone is bullying or blackmailing. Yeah, that's a lot for a teen. It's a lot for an adult, but for a teen who, may not have anyone to talk to about the situation, it's really scary.
Absolutely. I can talk about this topics for hours, but I've noticed we are toward the end of our time. Dr. Lanae, if our listeners wanted to get a hold of you, I know you have a number of different good materials in your websites, and I wanted to know what would be the best way for them to contact you.
Well, the best way to contact me, anybody can email me. It's mamasutra@me.com, mamasutra@me.com. That gets directly to me. I have a Google Voice number I can give you.
Sure.
The website as well. Actually, the website is probably even better. It's themamasutra.net. And I can give you a link for that too.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure that we put all of those great informations and links and everything in our show notes so our listeners can get a hold of you and benefit from all the great content and information that you put out there. I
look forward to it. I have a book coming out soon.
Oh, great.
It's still searching for a publisher, but I may end up just doing self-publishing and making it available on my website. But it goes into those 5 building blocks that I talked about.
Right.
It's the book is called Raising Sex Smart Teens.
Oh, what a neat title.
Hold on a second. It's Raising Sex Smart Kids. I'm working on Raising Sex Smart Teens right now. So yeah, I have that. And then I'm also working on having an online course coming up soon. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as they come out, please let me know and I'll make sure that I put it in our website so people can find you that way.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time. This was lovely.
Thank you. I've had a wonderful time today. Thank you.
Same here. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope my conversation with Dr. Lanae gave you some tips on how to talk to your teenager about this topics. I know it's not easy, especially if it hasn't been ongoing conversation, but I can guarantee that it's never too late. And if you apply the principle that she mentioned as far as being curious about their perspective and creating an environment of safety, I bet you'll be able to improve your relationship with them and also support them with exploring their sexuality. I would love to hear what have been your experiences with talking to your teenager. If you have a tip that's worked for you, please feel free to share with me. You can email me at Dr. Moali at Sexology Podcast, or tweet or drop a line in my social media, which is at oasis2care.com. That's our show for today. And make sure you check out our website to check out the links that Dr. Lanae mentioned. All right, I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening to the Sexology Podcast. For more great content, visit www.sexologypodcast.com. Please be advised that information presented on this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health provider.